So we're going to continue with our first Fireside chat session. And let me invite our moderator for the session, Neerav Berry, VP of App World and Payment Services at BlackBerry, and Venky Harinarayan, a serial entrepreneur and a fantastic person at heart. And he has co-founded Cosmix and Jungly, and you can read about him. You will have a fantastic time here.
Welcome everybody, and welcome Venky. Thanks for joining us today. Venky has one of the most amazing resumes I've seen lately. Last year, he was top 100 business people in the world, as well as top 100 venture capitalists. That is a pretty amazing combination to have. He sold companies to Amazon, to Walmart, and not just that, within these large companies, he's managed to create groundbreaking products. So at Amazon, he created the Amazon Marketplace, the Mechanical Turk, and to boot, he has a PhD from Stanford. So, amazing guy. I guess my first question, Venky, is that to me sounds like a rocket ship ride. Doesn't sound like a roller coaster to anybody here, right? So explain to the panel explain to the audience why you're here.
Yeah, I guess a couple things. One is the great thing about being in the Valley is it humbles you very quickly. And so you know for a fact that, while you think, you might be on a rocket ship, there are other guys who are on, I guess, spaceships going much faster. So it's always humbling from that point of view. And I always believe that if you're an entrepreneur, it's every day is sort of a fight. And, the great thing about doing it twice is you realize that just because you did it once, no one gives you anything when you start again the second time. You start from scratch and you work your way from scratch. And in fact, I think it's a little harder the second time around. So, I think that resume reads great. It was a struggle every day. Yeah.
Thanks for that. So let's talk about starting. When you started your companies, or the ones you invested in, how do you go about figuring out what is the right idea and when is the right time?
Yeah, so I always tell people, being an entrepreneur fundamentally means that you believe that 3 years from now, the world is going to be very different than what it is today. If the world is going to be the same 3 years from now or in the future, you don't have much of a job as an entrepreneur. And so there are two ways to sort of affect this change. Either there's a massive trend that's going on, which is growing so quickly that things look very different 3 years from now, and the rest of the world simply hasn't seen that compounding or has sort of internalized that compounding, and you have. And for example, how Jeff Bezos started Amazon was he saw the internet compounding at some phenomenal rate, and he just projected it out 3 years from then and said, hey, if the world looks that way 3 years from now, everybody is going to be on the internet, and having a bookshop is not going to be a bad thing. And so just projecting out 3 years on some phenomenal growth rate is one way to sort of think about a company, because you will meet the market in 2 years where the market's going to be, and the rest of the world doesn't really see that. The second way to do it is really to affect the change yourself. You believe that there's some need that you have that fundamentally is important, and you go in and you change the world literally. You don't meet the market, but you actually change the market. And I've seen both approaches work pretty well, and I've seen entrepreneurs have great success doing both. Where I think you can fail is really trying to solve for something which exists today and a pain point that exists today, because usually you're too late at that point, and those things are not really where entrepreneurs win. Larger companies tend to win with those sort of opportunities.
Great. What about let's talk a bit about the founding team. Should one have a co-founder? How many? What makes somebody a co-founder versus an initial VP of engineering?
Good point. So, you can definitely do things without a co-founder. I don't think it's impossible. It just sort of increases the degree of difficulty a huge amount, because you just take everything on yourself, and it just is hard, especially when things go south. It's always great to have someone to share the stress, if you will. And I've had experience, in the founder sort of spectrum. I've had, with Cosmix, I did it with one other co-founder of mine, Anand, and with Jungli, I had 4 other co-founders. And so I think there is a certain magic number. I think 5 is maybe too high and 2 is potentially the right number. But I do think the most important thing is less the number, less all of that, is sort of the chemistry that you have with your co-founding team. And I think that, when I've looked at it as an investor in many, many companies, I've actually seen the biggest reason startups fail early on is not because the market opportunity doesn't exist. It's not because, the product sucks. It's one contributing factor perhaps, but the number one reason I've seen is founders not getting along. And so, being a co-founder with someone else is sort of like being married to that person, and either you find a way to make it work, or it's a complete unadulterated disaster. And so, that I think is the most important thing when you are thinking about starting a company. It's really finding a co-founder who, you may not agree with on everything. In fact, when I did Cosmix with Anand, I think we agreed on pretty much nothing. But the reality is you want to have a way to trust the other person. So even if you're moving forward on a decision that you don't agree on, you're 100% committed to making it work. And I think that trust, is the most important thing. And that's where you sort of separate between VP of engineering and co-founder, which is just, do you have that trust in the other person? And do you think that they will step up to the plate when it's needed?
Fair enough. If we go back to your first company, what advice do you have for people looking for funding the very first time?
It's sort of funny. The first time around when we raised money for Jungli, it was actually on the way to Thai. We met this gentleman, Taira-san, and we convinced him not to go to Thai that day and rather come in and hear our pitch. And he ended up funding our company. In fact, I met him just today outside this session. I was like, Taira-san, it's maybe time I kidnapped you again. So, I think at the end of the day, the number one thing is you want to get money where you can get it. I think the money itself is a very important piece. And then if you have the good fortune of selecting investors, I believe, that's something which is a bonus. The one thing I would sort of maybe briefly talk about is just try and pick investors who specialize at the level at which you're doing it. Which is, if you're doing a seed round, you're raising less than $1 million, you want to get your company off the ground, I would not go in and try to raise that money from a top-tier venture firm. It just is the wrong fit, and it'll hurt you down the line. There are folks who specialize at certain levels, and I would strongly encourage that you look at the right folks for the right level. If you're doing a mezzanine round, try to get people who focus in on that round. And so where I've seen issues with investors is, a couple things. One is diluting way too much early on in your life, which is when I've looked at cap tables in the past, when you see bad cap tables, it's usually something that happened very early in a company's sort of life. So try to keep the early rounds less dilutive. And the second one is picking the wrong stage investor for the wrong round. And so I think in particular, don't try and pick top tier VCs for small angel rounds. I see a lot of that happening these days, and I'm just seeing the sort of effects of that, which are not super positive for the company itself.
Okay, so now we've got our fantastic vision funded, and now we're operational. What metrics should one follow? Are you optimizing for market share, customer acquisition, revenue, profits, and how do these change over time?
So I have great experience with this, having lived in Amazon when we believe profits absolutely didn't matter. So there is some truth to that if you look at where Amazon ended up. But I think it's super, super important that you understand at every stage in your company what metrics matter and what metrics don't matter. In fact, to the level of saying there are metrics and there are anti-metrics. So if you're a startup and you're focusing on profits is an absolute anti-metric. You'll do everything wrong if you worry about profits early in your startup's life. And so typically what I've seen happen is the progression is you start with customer wins, whether it's your consumer play or an enterprise play, you want to get customer wins. Revenue is an anti-metric early in sort of your existence, because you don't want to go do one-off deals that don't move the ball forward just for the sake of revenues. So you start with customer sort of wins, it moves to revenues, and usually it stays at revenues for the longest time. Revenues and revenue growth are what you care about. And you do not want to focus on profits too early because you stop making the right investments. And so you do want to focus on, customer wins, revenues, and then after you go public and you have hit the ball out of the park, profits.
Okay. Let's talk a bit about the entrepreneur's day-to-day struggle. You'll have the odd win, but most days are pretty tough. What advice do you have for fellow entrepreneurs? How does one cope?
At the end of the day, the way I've always looked at it is, we're super fortunate to be doing what we're doing. And, sometimes when I hear so much being written about being an entrepreneur, it's almost like, listen, this is not as, the much worse professions you could be doing in your life, right? In fact, one of the things we had to do in the early days of Amazon was I had to go to the warehouse and actually physically pack books. And I had the 9 p.m. to 4 a.m. shift, right? Because we just couldn't get enough workers for the first few holiday seasons. And trust me, packing books for 6 hours when your sort of granularity of operation is like 30 minutes or 30 seconds and doing the same thing repeatedly is absolutely terrible. What we do is phenomenal. It is, we have our downs, we have our ups, but it is, I would not be doing anything else, right? If you did not have the down, you would not have the up. So, I think each time when we go, and you do it all the time, right? Each time you plumb the depths, you always tell yourself, listen, that's the reason why the ups are so exciting is because the downs are also so dispiriting. That said, I think the one really important thing for guys who've got companies is, when a really smart guy told me this, is always celebrate the wins. The wins don't come often enough, and it is super important that when you have a win, you celebrate with your team and you really sort of make a big deal out of it, because there are just not enough wins in a startup.
Fair enough.
The downs tend to be much more frequent, as you know. Yeah.
Let's talk about the final win, right? The exit, or what seems at least one major milestone. So as you were, maybe you can bring us back to your days at Junglee or at Cosmix. When is the right time to exit? Do you go out and seek it? Or you wait for people to approach you? Do you hire a banker?
So the way I look at it is the following, right? I have this rule which, again, this is my own theory for whatever it's worth. I call it the 2-year rule, which is when you start a company, in the first 2 years of your life, most companies will have a really interesting exit opportunity. And the reason being, as an entrepreneur, like I said, you're early on the curve, you've identified some opportunity, some space that is sort of very interesting. And the rest, you're sort of ahead of the rest of the world if you're a good entrepreneur. And so the larger companies sort of realize this a year, 2 years into it, and they all have to start thinking about what they're going to do about that. And so then they sort of circle around, they want to come in and think of acquiring companies in this space so they can accelerate their roadmap. And so you typically have a good exit offer in the first 2 years. And you can decide not to take that. But what happens is, if you decide not to take it, the bets get made by the larger companies, the roadmaps get filled, and then it really is about you building the business, and it's less going to be about technology, vision, accelerating somebody's roadmap. It's about really acquiring a business. So when you turn down these 2-year offers, you're really signing up for another 3 to 5 years of really building out a business. And that's typically what I've seen. And I've seen this sort of pretty interesting bifurcation, which is you get the offers early and then it's a long slog. And then you might get an offer for the business, in year 5 or year 6.
Right. So let's say you're then lucky enough to get an offer, you get acquired. From my experience, at least, those are pretty jarring events once you walk into the big co, and your employees have often had a haircut and titles. What experience can you share there?
I hope that the haircut and titles are made up with some value for the equity. Otherwise, it's not super valuable. But actually, what I found, again, depending on the type of acquisition that you have been part of, if the acquisition was a positive one, there is a jolt of energy which comes into the organization. People are really excited, really sort of energized about the whole thing. And you have, having done this now 2 or 3 times on both sides, what I'd say is you have this period of irrational exuberance in the first 6 months, followed by a period of irrational doom, month 12 to month 18. And so you have to use the first 6 months after an acquisition when everybody is excited about it, the acquirers are excited, your employees are excited, and to actually, carve out some really significant wins. And, when I did the Amazon, when we were part of the Amazon acquisition, we really, the first time around, we hadn't thought through it to the degree of, we didn't have the clarity on it, and I would say we missed a couple of opportunities there. When we did the acquisition with Walmart, it was very clear that, that was a core focus for us because we'd gone through this before, really focused in on the wins, and the whole tenor of the acquisition becomes entirely different, where you actually, end up with something super valuable in month 18. You're actually able to navigate the period of doom if you have wins early on. Right. And so really, what you do is you focus on some real near-term sort of wins, commit to it entirely, get the wins, everybody's happy, and that just propels you on.
Okay. We're almost at time, so one last question. So you've been pretty fortunate in not only your own companies, but watching some pretty phenomenal companies at ground zero. Yahoo, Google, Facebook. What can you share with the audience?
I always tell people, I think there's a playbook for not losing. I think you can do smart things so you don't lose. I don't think there's a playbook for winning. Okay, winning is just, it's a lot of luck. It's a lot of being in the right place, right time. So, I don't think you learn very much in way of lessons from the winners, because it's just like, you contributed and what sort of was they won in spite of something. So I wouldn't really take the lessons from the winners very much. But one thing which I would share is, like Neerav was mentioning, I have seen, Facebook at 6 people, Yahoo at 6 people, Google at 2. And it's just amazing when you think about it. You blink an eye, 3 years later, these are absolutely, world sort of beating companies, right? So I think it's amazing that we live in a place and live in a time where that is possible, where you can truly come up with an idea that can change the world. And I've actually, seen it 3 times around, and each time it still sort of absolutely staggers you.
Great. Thank you very much, Venky.